Welcome to the keynote discussion, ESG, a new leadership model. I'm excited to kick off this conversation because as leaders throughout organizations, we are all experiencing significant, unprecedented change, whether we're talking about climate change or how we as employees are working together, addressing immigration, human rights issues, working from home. Even those of us who are remotely accessing this conference, times are changing. And it means we as leaders must adapt. And one of the biggest trends and biggest topics for us to be adapting to is the topic of ESG. And I'm not going to define that yet because I'm excited to welcome to this conversation a longtime friend and, more importantly, a remarkable mentor of mine that I'm going to recommend. If you are not following, go to LinkedIn, sign up. Alison Taylor syndicates all this information into practical, easy to understand terms that allows us to adapt as leaders on a daily basis. And so I'm very, very excited to welcome to the conversation, Alison Taylor.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. It's such a delight to be here and to talk to you.
So I'm going to ask you to define the acronym ESG, but more importantly, can you explain how it started, where we are, and where you think it's going to be going?
Absolutely. I think it's an excellent question. There are a few acronyms out there that cause more confusion today. So let's start off by getting grounded. And I think what we need to say is that questions about the role of business in society are not new. Cicero discussed them in 44 BC. They were discussed in the 18th century. They were discussed in the 20th century, and we're still discussing them today. So in the late 20th century, though, we saw a huge rise in concern about irresponsible business practices. And it was really focused at that time on the supply chain. So there was lots of scrutiny over apparel companies moving to cheaper markets to take advantage of cheap labor, lots of concern about deforestation and that kind of thing. So as business globalized, we started to become more concerned about businesses' externalities and more focused on the idea that business might help us solve some of our biggest challenges. So that's the background, and it's very, very much a movement about ethical business and responsible business, and really takes those questions as front and center. So more recently, and the term ESG was coined in 2005 at the UN, we have this idea of environmental, social, and governance factors. But what we call ESG today is really more a set of tools and a set of metrics used by investors to score companies into good and bad, and design investment firms are built around these metrics. So we can think of ESG as an investor attempt to measure this appetite for responsible business and turn it into making more money. So that's a very valid and interesting framework. But one of the reasons I think you see so much confusion out there is that people are using ESG to mean responsible business and vice versa. And they're not exactly the same thing. So I think ESG is incredibly valuable and incredibly interesting as a trend for how these ideas have become mainstream. But I think if you're trying to be a more ethical, responsible business, it's important not to mix up ESG and sustainability and responsible business.
Something I recently saw, it was probably from your LinkedIn feed, that was talking about ESG used to be how investors looked at impact on money, and now lay people, society, are looking at ESG as how is it impacting me? You know, what are the outputs of the business? And they aren't the same.
Exactly. So there's an idea about what are the environmental, social factors that are risk to my business, and then there are notions of what's the impact of my business. And so the public, of course, cares much more about the impact of the business than the risk to the business. And in general, it's very, very understandable, but it can be a bad idea to frame these concepts in terms of, I only care about this to the degree it might make me more money. That's not necessarily what your stakeholders are looking for.
And one thing I really love, and I think about our audience, is I even view that is kind of the role of procurement. When I first started working in major corporations, procurement protected me from the outside. If someone wanted to, become a supplier for my former company, it was procurement out there fighting them off, so I wasn't inundated with emails. But I almost see now procurement being the source of innovation outside for me as a way to get out there and have someone constantly looking to see what is outside the world, changing the world to help me come, bring that in. So it's almost, I see procurement in a very similar pattern to the ESG that we were just talking about. And I'd be fascinated to hear, Alison, I've heard an estimation that for an organization, it's something between 60 and 80% of environmental, social, and therefore governance issues sit outside of the organization in the supply chain. Can you talk a little bit about some of those stats or figures to help us calibrate what it means to kind of run the corporate ecosystem and how we can influence that for good?
Oh, it's such a good question. And I think probably supply chain leaders are most front and center in these conversations. It's hard to think of another function that's really experiencing the pressure on these issues like supply chain. And you're right, we used to, back in the 20th century, before the rise of this concern I just talked about, have the idea that the company's the company, and then what your supply chain does, what your value chain does, is nothing to do with you and not your problem. And so when companies in the 20th century started to come under pressure, their initial response was, my supply chain has nothing to do with me. That's not the idea we have today. Today we have the idea that you are responsible for things like slave labor or trafficking or even carbon emissions in your supply chain, and you're supposed to be taking steps to control and manage and understand what's going on out there. That is extremely difficult. Your supply chain has many tiers. There's starting now to be a lot of regulation out of the EU saying that you have to be responsible for knowing what goes on in your supply chain. And then the notion of scope 3 emissions is the idea that you can control the carbon emissions and energy use in your supply chain. So I think the problem that we're having is we haven't really come to a consensus yet on what good supply chain oversight looks like. And so that's really putting supply chain leaders front and center there. We're also seeing a lot of geopolitical challenges and tensions, most obviously over China showing up in the supply chain. Lots of companies starting to bifurcate or localize their supply chains. So there's been a lot of reporting recently saying that, strategic leadership in the 2020s will be focused on supply chain leaders. And I really think that's true, because it's not so easy to set the limits and to really kind of understand these new pressures. And they're probably the most strategic business issues today. I think in general, we're moving right from this notion that cost and time is all that matters to the idea that what we need is a more resilient set of business networks. But I think we're just at the very beginning of the conversation of how to go about that.
One thing that I would love to talk to you a little bit about is, for me, if we focus on the E, I feel there's heavy emphasis and dare I say greater clarity around environment, specifically around greenhouse gas emissions in supply chain. There's a lack of data, but I feel like we're moving forward. You mentioned some of the progress the EU is making, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it's around the human rights due diligence potential law, and that excites me from a human rights perspective. But from a governance business perspective, I've been scouring trying to find, with that law, potentially pending. Where would you suggest, and what are we talking about in that human rights piece? Would you mind discussing a little bit about, from a human rights perspective, what we in procurement and supply chain management should be thinking about ahead of that?
Sure, it's another great question. I think you're right. I mean, I certainly think we've got a long way to go on the E and climate change measurement, but environmental issues are a little bit easier to quantify and measure than social issues, and human rights is a dimension of the kind of social issues that we're talking about. So yes, there is a spate of laws now coming up and being rolled out in the EU and various EU countries saying that you need to due diligence on the human rights impacts of your supply chain. So the first step, really, it might sound very obvious, but actually I meet a number of companies that aren't 100% clear in terms of even who their suppliers are and where they're located and how dependent they are. So I think you need to start out with an understanding of where you're sourcing from, where the risks lie, what procurement spend you are making, if you have a lot of dependencies or vulnerabilities. There was a hurricane in Puerto Rico a few years ago, and a lot of medical device firms found themselves in real trouble because they were sourcing disproportionately from Puerto Rico. So in that kind of climate disruption, they really, faced a lot of problems. So I think you need to understand what your human rights risks are. You need to understand the risks of key commodities. You need to map those risks, and then you need to start off by doing diligence, doing audits, and really trying to kind of understand what's going on. What is worrying me a little bit is that I see a lot of focus on liability. And so companies saying, here's a questionnaire and here's what you need to sign up to as our supplier. And that's really an effort to protect the main company from liability. I think what we need to be thinking about that would be much more productive and resilient in the long term is how can we have more robust partnerships with key suppliers. So a lot of companies, Levi's is springing to mind, provided supply chain finance and partnerships to keep some of their key suppliers going through COVID, because they understood we could just let them all go out of business, but that's probably not going to be, it's not very human rights friendly, it's not very ethical, and it's probably not good for our business over the long term. So really, I think what we need to be doing is evolving our thinking from the supply chain as a source of risk and a problem to thinking how we can partner with key suppliers to drive better human rights standards, to drive better labor standards, to drive better environmental standards, and really thinking about this as a key collaborative strategic partnership rather than a horrible external risk we have to manage. Now, that's easier said than done because, as I've already mentioned, we haven't really come to a consensus on what good practice looks like. But I think a very litigious, risk-led approach is likely to be less effective over the long term than thinking, how can I work with my suppliers to their benefit and our benefit as well?
We started off our conversation about ESG and it's kind of these directions and this direction. Where do you think ethical business is going to be taking us in the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, this is another great question. We're in the middle of, at least in the US, somewhat of an ESG backlash at the moment, with lots of people saying, well, it doesn't work, and this idea of having a single score doesn't work, and this has just been a big gravy train for investors. There's a big political backlash going on in the US. But I think we have to remember that the way that business creates value has dramatically changed in the past several decades. So it used to be that the value of your company was very largely based on tangible physical assets, things like land, buildings, machinery, cash, etc. And now a much, much larger part of business is based on intangible assets. By that, I mean things like brands, data, intellectual property, R&D, network effects, and at the end of the day, stakeholder trust. So regardless of what happens to ESG frameworks, I think that pressure and expectation, especially from young people, rising concern about climate change, rising polarization, really big shifts in power dynamics inside organizations. We can think about the Me Too movement. So all those drivers aren't going away. We might see a change to what terms the investment industry is using. We might see a more effort to break up analysis of environmental and social factors because, to your point, you could close a factory and reduce your carbon emissions. You'll also probably have a negative impact on human rights. So I think we're in the middle of a very healthy reckoning, looking at the rigor and the level of rigor of the current analysis and trying to better it. But I think it's a bad idea to pay too much attention to all the the skeptics out there saying ESG is going to disappear, because the underlying drivers that caused ESG in the first place are still very, very much alive and well. So in the next 12 to 18 months, I think we'll see more and more transparency. I think we'll see more revelations. I think we'll see more whistleblowing. I think we'll see more employee voice. We're going to see more and more Gen Z students graduating and entering the workforce. We'll see more conversations about work from home and ethical culture. I basically think these are the most business critical issues of the 2020s. So I may be a little bit biased.
But I'm experiencing it. I think those, everyone watching, working remotely is a new norm. You click a Zoom or some other link, and you're here and hearing conversations from people thousands of miles apart from one another, and it's real time. I think that wasn't maybe my last question, but I also love, again, I can't encourage everyone enough. I love hearing your content. And one of the things that from the very beginning, when you and I started working together, as far back as 2015, you talked a lot about employee engagement. And as leaders, even within our own procurement functions, I would love to hear your thoughts, not just for procurement, but how to engage employees to get their insights, to get their learnings, especially as new employees are entering in. So what are some of the best practices that you'd recommend for a leader to learn from? Many of our procurement colleagues watching are at the front lines of what we're talking about. And so how can we get that information up to executives to help inform better decisions? Any tips on that?
Yeah, so I think the rise of employee voice is hugely significant and rather dramatic. And one of the challenges with it is we tend to think about employee voice in terms of whistleblowing and calling the hotline. But what employees are concerned about today is just as likely to be, are you valuing profits over purpose? Are you paying enough attention to climate change? Are you responding properly to allegations of sexism or racism? Are you really nurturing me and mentoring me as I want to be nurtured? And none of those issues you're necessarily going to call the speak up line over. So I think it's really important for the leaders today who might naturally feel rather threatened by this dramatic rise in employee voice to rather view it as an asset. So you need to build mechanisms and processes and structures to allow your employees to share their opinions, because if you don't build those internal mechanisms, it's quite likely they'll be sharing those opinions on Twitter or Instagram, and then you will be subject to a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of reputational risk. So I would absolutely favor surveys, focus groups, discussions, input from employees on values. And in general, I think what we need is for senior leaders to acknowledge it's not about how good a leader or how ethical a leader you are, but power creates insensitivity. If you have a lot of power, it's easy to think you're not intimidating. It's easy to think someone could just get in touch with you anytime and ask for advice. But that's not how power actually works. And we all have blind spots that we need to correct. So I think for the leading companies, what you're really seeing out there is a lot more effort to capture and harness and listen to employee voice. Not the same thing as manipulating employee voice, but really understanding it's a kind of early warning signal of a reputational challenge in the future. And employees do see and hear about the organization in very, very different ways. And it is, if you can collect and use that, just probably the most valuable thing you can do to protect your business and make it more resilient today.
Thank you. And I think with that, we're going to have to bring our discussion on ESG, a new leadership model, to close. But I want to leave you with a thought. I opened it up with there's a lot of change happening. And Alison, your last voice, or the last piece on employee voice, is a critical one. And it's even for you watching now. We need you during this time to provide clarity during this chaos that employees are feeling, whether they're feeling lonely or overwhelmed with everything they're having to do. And so please take this conversation and don't just sit with it, but understand your company's purpose, your own purpose, what you're trying to accomplish, and get out there and take action, because that's what we're going to need. I call this the decade of our lives. Many of us in the industry do. And every 5 weeks, we're losing 1%. So go out there with purpose, take action, And thanks for joining us today. As always, Alison, I hate when the time comes to a close, but it's always wonderful to hear your insights, and thanks for sharing them.
So great to see you. Thank you for having me.